Hello and welcome to GameSack. The SEGA Channel for the Genesis was way ahead of its time. It's kind of like a proto version of Xbox Game Pass, if you will. Now, the trials for the SEGA Channel started in June of 1994, and it officially launched in Pittsburgh, of all places, in December of that same year. Quickly moved across the US to other cities. And it wasn't limited to the United States, believe it or not. In fact, it was available in limited capacities around the world. And despite Denver being the place that broadcast the SEGA Channel to the satellites, it was never offered here, so I was never able to experience it in its own time. Anyway, let's take a closer look at the channel. Let's go! In order to use the SEGA Channel, you need this special adapter which plugs into the cartridge slot. This was often bundled with a subscription to the SEGA Channel, which was usually around $13 extra a month on top of your pre-existing cable charges, as well as a one-time $25 activation fee. This adapter here has a part attached to the back of it which kindly requests that it not be removed. And it also says hand tighten only for when you attach the coaxial cable to it. Like seemingly everything for the Genesis, it requires its very own power supply. It wants 15 volts, and it won't work without this at all. There's a menu button to access the menu, which we'll get to shortly. You can use this adapter with a Model 1 Genesis as it is, or with an adapter plate for the Model 2. This is the 32X adapter plate, and it works, but the SEGA Channel one looked a bit different. You didn't absolutely need it though. Assuming everything is hooked up and powered correctly, you'll get the SEGA Channel intro and landing screen, and it'll stay on this while it tries to connect to the service. If it can't find the service, you'll get this message. Obviously, the SEGA Channel no longer exists, but there are ROMs out there that do a great job of giving you access to the menu and a taste of the experience. Here in the menu, you have several different categories of games to choose from, like Sports Arena for sports games, Wings and Wheels for flying and racing games, the Family Room for what Sega considered family-oriented games, I guess, the Arcade for, well, arcade-style games, Swords and Spells for what I feel should be RPG games, but Revenge of Shinobi is in here. Then again, this ROM was constructed by fans and shouldn't necessarily be taken as gospel for what was available on the SEGA Channel. The Think Tank is for puzzle games, and Classics for what Sega considered classics. There was a game guide section that would let you load some game instructions, as well as a news link section which told you what was coming to the SEGA Channel soon. There was also a popular test drives area where you could play upcoming or newly released games. These were usually restricted with a time limit of 20 minutes for action games and 30 minutes for slower games like an RPG. You could play them over and over, but of course you'd have to start from the beginning each time. There was even an Express game section which isn't in this menu. That would let you play games that were in the test drive section the previous month without the time limit for 48 hours, but it'll cost you $3 a pop. The game library changed out every month, and eventually they began rotating it every 2 weeks. Once you pick a game, you have to wait until the game was broadcast. It wasn't on demand like the internet is today. Instead, the games were broadcast in a rotating loop. You would often have to wait up to a minute or more before the game you selected was broadcast, and then, well, down it comes. This wasn't foolproof, as the download could get errors or fail, prompting the adapter to crash. Once it did successfully download, you could play the game as normal. It would basically perform like you had the cartridge inserted into the machine. As long as it wasn't a timed game, you could play it as much as you wanted. However, once you powered the Genesis off, the game would erase. So it wasn't really good trying to make progress in games that use a save feature. However, if you rented games a lot, the SEGA Channel might have been a good deal if you already had cable anyway. The SEGA Channel is extremely difficult to document as the games often changed and there's no official list of games anywhere. What is known, however, is that there were a lot of different games to play on the service over its lifetime. So let's take a look at some of the games that were available to play but didn't get physical releases here in the United States. That's right, the SEGA Channel was the only way to play these games unless you imported them back then. Up first is Alien Soldier from Treasure. I always found it amazing that this one never got a physical release here in North America. You play as some sort of anthropomorphic bird guy thing. The story is incredibly bizarre, so I'm not even going to try to follow what's going on here. You can equip up to 4 different weapons and cycle through them at any time. But be careful as they don't have unlimited power, or force as the game calls it, and they need time to recharge. That's why you switch to another one when the current one gets low. The game is mostly a boss rush, with very little in the way of normal stage progression like you'd find in most action platformers. Mainly in these parts, you shoot down minor enemies, getting a bit of life back, and you also get the opportunity to power up your weapons. Doing that will give them a lot more force, which makes them far more effective against the bosses. Of course, each area has many different bosses, each designated to its own stage. There are 25 stages in all, which means 25 major boss fights. It's overwhelming at first, and it does take a small amount of time to adjust to the gameplay. It's very easy to take damage, but fortunately you have a dash move which starts you to the other side of the screen. The game calls this teleporting for some reason. Anyway, you're invincible while doing this, and mastering this technique is absolutely mandatory. When your life is full, you can do a power dash, which can really damage the bosses. The gameplay is honestly very technical, and it's not one that you can just pick up and play. You can also lose your muscle memory for the game if you haven't played it for a while, requiring you to relearn some things. The graphics are fantastic, just as you'd expect from Treasure, with lots of cool visual treats all over the place throughout the entire game. Multi-jointed, segmented bosses are everywhere. There's even a tribute to the Gunstar Heroes boss 7 Force with a transforming boss who has many different forms. Hell, it even uses the music from Gunstar Heroes here. Speaking of the music and the sound are both great as well and help keep the energy level high. This game is pure sweaty palms excitement from beginning to end, if you can make it to the end. Now you may look at Alien Soldier and think, wow, the SEGA Channel has a ton of amazing, unobtainable titles. Well, they may be unobtainable to most, but they're not all amazing. Check it out. Here's Battle Frenzy, also known as Bloodshot. It's from Domark. This one is a first-person shooter. At the time, Wolfenstein 3D was all the rage, and Doom was pretty new and was also super popular. So Domark tried giving us this. It's impressive for its time and the hardware. In fact, I could have included it in the last episode about 3D games in the 16-bit era, but I didn't want to talk about this particular game twice in a row. I mean, it's not that good. Still, everything here uses software scaling and it can get pretty choppy. You have different weapons you can collect as you blast your enemies apart. Of course, you'll need to find keys to open doors, as was the norm for the early first-person shooter games. There's not much going on here with the audio, sadly. This is a good game to have on the SEGA Channel. It's one that you'd probably want to try out, especially at the time, but it's not really something you'd actually want to buy. Next up is Body Count from Probe and SEGA. I just talked about this one a few episodes ago, you know, the one with Dave and all of the Super Scope and Menacer games, so I'm not going to focus on this one very much here. Anyway, it was only released physically in Europe. You can play it with a controller, a mouse, or the SEGA Menacer. It's basically an arcadey light gun shooter where you need to shoot the enemies as the stages scroll on by. There are some power-ups you can get, as well as the usual stuff like life and ammo refills. Speaking of ammo, it's not unlimited, but it does drain quite slowly. I mean, it might as well be unlimited. You also have a special powerful shot you can fire, but that, of course, is quite limited. The grenade icon tells you how many you have left. As I said when I talked about this one before, the enemies are bullet sponges. However, the visuals are great and the audio isn't bad. I've read that light gun games have issues functioning properly with the SEGA Channel. I don't really understand how that could be, as the games run like you're playing them from a cartridge once it's downloaded, but again, I read it, so I suppose it's worth mentioning. If any of you go back in time and play this on the SEGA Channel with your Menacer, well, consider yourself warned. It's possible that a translated version of Dino Brothers 2 is available to play on the SEGA Channel at some point. This is a real-time strategy game from CRI that can kinda be figured out if you mess with it long enough. Basically, there's a master egg and you can tell it to lay dinosaur eggs. Eventually you can tell it what kind of dinosaur eggs you'd like it to pop out. The dinos eventually hatch and wander around. As you can imagine, the different dinosaurs have their own strengths and weaknesses. Elsewhere in the stage, there are bad guys that are busy doing their own thing. When your dinos and the bad guys meet, they'll automatically fight. Once you defeat all of the bad guys, the stage is over and you move on to the next. I don't fully understand it yet, as this is my first time messing with this one, but honestly, it's not bad, and it probably would be fun to play in English. The graphics are pleasant, and the music is very lively. I don't know how well a physical version would have sold had it been released, but it would have been nice to have anyway. Part of me is skeptical that they actually translated this one to play on the SEGA Channel because that just seems like a lot of effort for this game. But hey, weirder things have definitely happened in the world of video games. So let me ask you guys who actually had the SEGA Channel this. Do any of you remember actually playing this one on the SEGA Channel back in its time? Please, please, please comment if you do, especially if you're in the US. I hope that this one gets a fan translation someday. The first Dino Brothers game is partially translated already. And here's Golden Axe 3 from SEGA themselves. This one is often considered the black sheep of the family, at least of the Genesis games, but it's better than you might have been led to believe. You can choose from 4 characters, but not the fan favorite dwarf because, of course not. The game kind of gives a bad first impression. The first level graphics aren't super appealing, and the characters and enemies all look rather flat and dull. What's more is that the animation, well, it kinda sucks. The characters and the enemies have absolutely none of the polish of the first game. Still, the game actually does play pretty well. Taking a nod from the arcade-exclusive Golden Axe The Revenge of Death Adder, which preceded this game by a year, you can choose your route in certain parts of the game. This adds to the overall replayability. While there are many different stages, they don't all have their own unique boss fights. I like how when you do die, it shows you the path that you took on the map. And you did. I love it. Your moves are pretty standard for the series, and each character has their own set of attacks. There are a lot of enemies which will outright block your attacks, which can be a tad annoying. Of course, you have magic that you can use just like the previous games. Each character has 3 levels of their own magic. You collect vials, and once that segment is red, that's the level of magic that you'll use if you press the A button. Any remaining vials can be used as your weakest attack, so you don't necessarily use all of the vials each time you use magic, which is cool. The game is rather easy, even with the enemies that constantly block you, especially if you use this big tough guy in all of his continues. Visually, the game is a mixed bag. I've already mentioned the player characters and the enemies. The backgrounds do have their moments though. There's almost always some parallax scrolling going on, which definitely helps things out. The first game didn't have any parallax scrolling, at least not on the Genesis. The colors tend to be a bit dull, however. Also, the magic effects are not as impressive as the first game. The music is well composed with some great melodies, though the sound driver could be more punchy. The sound effects and the samples themselves are rather poor. This is only an 8 meg game, and honestly it could have used twice that. Given the time that this was released, that still would have been a low amount of memory. Still, this one is worth trying out, and it even features 2-player simultaneous play if you actually have any friends, but I'm pretty sure that you don't. This game was exclusive to the SEGA Channel, and it was programmed by David Crane himself. You know, he made Pitfall, Ghostbusters, and, well, lots of other games. This one was thought to be lost forever until David Crane gave a cartridge to the National Video Game Museum in Frisco, Texas. And that's where I got this ugly video from. Sadly, they haven't dumped it, so no ROM is currently available. Then again, it is solitaire. Back in the mid-90s, there was one title that I really wanted to play, and I knew it was a SEGA Channel exclusive at the time. Of course, I didn't have the SEGA Channel, and I couldn't get the SEGA Channel, so I kept waiting for them to announce a cartridge version, but they never did for my hometown of the United States, yeah. Well, what game is it? Why, this next one, of course. Mega Man: The Wily Wars from Capcom was a desirable title at the time, which you could only play on the SEGA Channel if you were a United Statesian. I say United Statesian because I've had people from South America lose their absolute mind when I say American. Anyway, us Americans with the SEGA Channel could try out the first 3 NES games all gussied up for the Genesis. You can choose to play Mega Man 1, which started it all with its quirkiness, Mega Man 2, which improves things immensely and was responsible for the series becoming well known, and Mega Man 3, which isn't bad either. Gameplay-wise, everything is here. However, the controls feel a bit slow and/or laggy compared to the NES games. When you start to press a direction, you tiptoe forward before taking off running. This happens every time and is very weird until you get used to it. The NES games do this too, but it's much more pronounced here. I guess it makes it easier to position yourself on intricate ledges, but it also makes the game feel much slower to respawn when you need it to respawn. Next, you can't fire your weapons as fast as the original games. These games don't have a difficulty select, unlike the NES version of Mega Man 2, which it defaulted to the easy mode. As a result, things tend to take a lot more hits. Some of the bosses in parts 1 and 3 take more hits here as well. Not being able to shoot as fast here doesn't exactly help. Weirdly though, this section in Mega Man 1 feels much slower than the NES version, and as a result, it's a ton easier. You needed to have very quick reflexes in the original game, but not so much here. This game also features tons of slowdown when barely anything is on screen. The NES games barely had any slowdown that I remember. Things like the pause-unpause glitch in Mega Man 1 have been removed. The good news though is now you have 3 different save slots, each of which saves your progress in all 3 games. No more silly passwords here. However, game saves aren't going to help you if you're playing on the SEGA Channel. Once you've cleared all 3 Mega Man games, the Wily Tower opens up. This is an all-new section where you can choose your weapons and items from any of the 3 games. The stages reuse the enemies and traps, but it looks completely different. It's cool that they added this instead of just having it be a straight-up compilation. I wonder if anyone ever got to this area on the SEGA Channel without game saves. The graphics, of course, have been redone for the Genesis. They all look quite good, with tons of color everywhere. Parallax scrolling is often visible in most of the stages as well. The sound and music also got an upgrade, if you can call it that. The music certainly isn't bad, but the sound driver that they used is pretty weak. It's also completely in mono. The Genesis can do far better audio than this. The sound effects similarly sound a little sad. As a result, I think I prefer the NES version of the music as it's just more energetic. This is a great game for the SEGA Channel, but honestly, with the massive slowdown, laggy controls, slightly weak music and all that, it kind of makes the Genesis look a little bit weak next to the NES. While this did get a release in Japan and Europe, us Americans can finally play this on the Genesis Mini, and there's also a physical release that was put out not too long ago by Retrobit. And here's Mr. Nuts from Ocean. This mascot platformer was only released in Europe and Australia. You play as a squirrel trying to collect nuts and make his way to the end of every level. Everyone and everything is out to get you. It's a well-known fact that squirrels have no friends, only enemies. You can bounce on most enemies to defeat them. If you have any nuts in your squirrel inventory, you can throw nuts at the enemies and they die. You can also collect coins because why the hell not, you're a squirrel. Each area has 5 levels to go through. What's nice is that each level doesn't look identical to the last, just with a different layout. Instead, it actually makes it feel like you're making some progress. The 5th area is a fearsome boss fight. I like this stage showing the squirrel in his natural Arctic habitat with Eskimos trying to skewer him. Gotta admit, he does look tasty. None of the levels have any checkpoints and most aren't very large, but a few of them will definitely have you wishing for some checkpoints. The controls are momentum based, meaning that when you jump from platform to platform, you have the urge to press backwards before you land on them to make sure you don't slide off or float past. It's often very easy to get hit, so it can be wise to take it kind of slow. The graphics are excellent. It makes you wonder why so many other Genesis games can't be this colorful. The sound and music is just kind of there. It's not offensive or noteworthy at all. As a game, it's decent, but it doesn't live up to the many other better action platformers available on the console. Still, this one would be a good one to spend an afternoon on, so make sure your cable TV is hooked into your Genesis and give it a download today. Oh god, here's Nightmare Circus from Funcom. This is a highly unfinished game with some of the worst controls you'll ever experience. The game provides no direction of what it wants you to do. I'll oftentimes die without having any clue why. There's not much here that could be called good. Actually, there isn't anything here that's good. Supposedly, this actually got a physical release in Brazil. I guess that's not surprising since Tectoy has very low standards, if any standards at all. Don't waste your time downloading this trash onto your SEGA Channel. Next up is Power Drive from US Gold and Rage Software. Ah yes, US Gold, known throughout the world for their excessive quality. Notice I didn't say good quality. This one is a top-down racing game, rally style. It's rather difficult for games like this to actually be good, and when they are, they're usually on the Neo Geo. This one is no exception, as it's a mediocre game at best. At first, it's not bad though. You race around by yourself, concerned only with beating the clock. Other races are lap-based and have you racing an opponent. In these, you need to complete 4 laps. You can beat the opponent if you're good, but I've seen you play video games and you are not. The good news though is that you don't have to beat the opponent, just the clock. There are objects on the course to help you out. One is a little clock which will stop you from accruing time for about 5 seconds. Another is a nitro boost which gives you flaming wheels and a burst of speed for a few seconds. The last icon is a stack of money which will be added to whatever you earn simply by finishing the race successfully. Your opponent can't collect these items, they're only for you. Between races, you use the money to repair damage to your car. But there's never a shop to buy better parts, at least not that I've seen anywhere. Don't worry about running out of money though, as that is incredibly unlikely. In fact, this game is immensely easy until you get up to this stage. Here, it wants you to do tricks like drifting in a circle and you need to do them all within the time limit. This kind of stuff really brings the game down. The modern Dirt series also suffers from this problem with its dumb Gymkhana events. I don't like doing this crap, so that's when I reset the game and tried using some passwords. And wouldn't you know it, they don't even work. The graphics are okay. Nothing stands out much except for the use of the highlight mode when you have headlights on. The music is also okay, but there are no sound effects at all. This really makes you feel detached from the game. You can change it to music or sound effects in the options, but they seriously couldn't figure out how to have both playing at the same time. This isn't an early PC like the Amiga, which only had 4 channels, guys. Yeah, I think I'm done playing this title, and I can understand why it was limited to the SEGA Channel. Then there was even a possibly translated version of Pulseman from Game Freak on the SEGA Channel. This is an action platformer where you play as an electrified dude who can go into TVs, I guess. He looks like he's a boss that escaped from a Mega Man game. You jump, punch, and the third button is called your Voltecker. Basically, it does nothing on its own. But if you run back and forth and build up a tiny bit of speed, you get charged with electricity. While charged, if you press the punch button, you'll fire off a projectile attack once. Or if you press the A button, you bounce around the screen diagonally until you press A again to stop it. You'll have to use this a lot to get around certain parts of the many, many stages in this game. Lastly, there are electric lines that you can ride just by pressing the A button, and you don't need to charge yourself up first. Beware of the water because it makes it so you can't use your Voltecker at all because water and electricity don't mix. These water stages are all a huge pain in the ass, by the way. I just thought you'd like to know. Pulseman runs at a few different speeds and it takes a while to get used to. It feels a bit choppy, and I never felt confident that Pulseman would go where I wanted him to or behave. The Voltecker can be a bit awkward to use sometimes. You can take 3 hits and then you die, so you really need to be extra careful. The graphics are interesting. They start out looking very nice and well drawn. But there are a lot of stages here that are absolute eyesores, like some of the worst visuals I've ever seen. Yikes, my eyeballs. The casino level looks like an unstructured, flashing mess. This game also makes very liberal use of dithering, and it looks awful in RGB, like I'm playing here. The only way you can truly enjoy the visuals here is via composite video on a really bad consumer CRT that doesn't cost very much. That'll make it more blurry like this, so you can't really see the dithering. If you have a decent CRT, you're still going to be able to make out the dithering though, even with composite. On my Genesis, you get massive rainbow bars like these in composite, so there's really no winning with this game for me. The music is mostly pretty good. There's a lot of voice here, but it sounds a bit scratchy. Still, if you can adapt to the controls, you'll find a lot of gameplay here if you choose to download it on the SEGA Channel. Hopefully, you were able to beat it before they took it down. This game eventually came out on the Wii Virtual Console. And there you go, the SEGA Channel. Now, like I said earlier, this service and the games that were available for it are fairly difficult to document these days. These are some of the titles that we can be pretty sure were available on the SEGA Channel at some point. Sometimes games that were released on cartridge have special SEGA Channel versions, and those currently have no known ROM leaks. Of course, there may be a few titles on this list that are in error, or there may be others that are missing that should be listed here. Regardless, during its time there were a ton of different titles to choose from and play. Of course, it had the biggest success in the United States as well as Canada, lasting 4 years before it shut down completely. Overall, I'd say that it was a very interesting service, especially for its time. So did you have the SEGA Channel? And if you did, what were your experiences with it? Please let me know, because I'm very curious to hear about it. And in the meantime, thank you for watching GameSag. Nobody tells me what to do. Oh, that doesn't sound good. Uh-oh. I'm in the SEGA Channel. Gross. Oh well, at least I didn't eat Pebble Beach golf links.
The real battle starts right now.